Henshall here again for the Constitutional Crisis Channel. Another in our series of current events topics. This one will not be without a lot of perceived controversy, but very little of the actual stuff. Now, this video is Donald Trump versus Muhammad Ali. Who's right? As some of you may be aware from following the internet, Ali has called out Trump based on his policy of excluding all the Syrian refugees and potentially others as well from coming into the United States, especially based on the fact that a lot of them might be terrorists in disguise. And there are a lot of people that are frankly accusing Trump of the repetition of the events of World War II with the internment of the Japanese and the famous case of Korematsu versus United States. As you might expect if you've listened to my earlier videos, I agree with Trump on this one because, coming from a nation like that with which we are arguably at war, and you have no reasonable way to know who you're letting in here, whether they're a terrorist, whether they're a mole, whoever it is, I think Congress can simply pass a law and say none of you are going to come in here, and they can do it most particularly when you consider the real citizenship here is based on the common law jus sanguinis. That's citizenship by blood, not jus soli, citizenship by soil. Just because you're born here does not make you a citizen. And I don't care, all you advocates of the 14th Amendment, can do whatever you want, cry about it, yell at me, doesn't matter. The 14th Amendment does not exist. It never has. Therefore, that citizenship does not exist. That puts Congress on even better ground to keep out aliens of whatever description they have in mind to do. I mean, it's a privilege to come here. If it's a privilege, that means whoever grants the privilege has the control to do it. I would like it a whole lot better if we had qualified members in Congress in both the House and the Senate. That's a story for another day, but trust me, we don't. But that said, I think Congress should take some actions here, especially given recent events, although many of those, in my own personal view, have been orchestrated behind the scenes by the government. And yes, I've already conceded in earlier videos I'm a conspiracy theorist, but don't be surprised if a lot of information comes out on events like this where the United States government indirectly or otherwise was involved in some of these mass shootings we've had recently and this, that, and the other. But that said, I agree with Trump that, and especially in the case of Muslims in particular, but it extends beyond that. Because that's an area, the Near East, that have a lot of controversy, a lot of states of war, with the ISIS and this, that, and the other. And by the way, I'll be the first one to say that I think people over there have some very legitimate grievances against the government of the United States, the government of England, and other European governments for being, taking part in their affairs and destroying the sovereignty of those nations and creating new nations, like they've done since the end of World War I, where you used to have, the Persian Empire and this, that, and the other. Now you don't have it anymore. Hell, Iraq didn't exist up until the 1920s, to name one. Kuwait, there's another one that just created out of thin air by a colonel in the British Army. I mean, they have good grounds to be upset with us. That said, and I agree with a lot of that, to do what's been done in their names, if in fact they're the ones doing it, is entirely inappropriate, and these things should be dealt with as acts of war, whether they occur in Paris, Luxembourg, whatever. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. So we have to get these situations under control, and the best way we can do that is to get the American interest out, particularly the oil companies who never should have been there in the first place, in the guise in which they got there, and deal with these other nations, internationally, one-on-one, and come to agreeable terms and conditions for trade and purchases and what have you. And again, in my own personal view, I think we'd be far better off going up to Prudhoe Bay, Alaska, and starting to take out all the oil reserves that we have up there, which is more than the Arabs could ever imagine. And it surely can be done these days relatively safely and environmentally, friendly, and get the oil down here, and or create other sources of energy like we're doing now with electric cars and so forth, that's even better. And get ourselves back on a footing where we don't have to deal with these people and leave them to their own devices. If we don't need their oil, think about this a second. If we don't need the oil and they don't have any foreign trade of that type, how are they going to feed their populations? Think about that. It's very hard to grow lettuce and carrots and turnips and whatever in desert sand. That's a pretty good trick, and they don't have it. So, we can just say, fine, you don't want to deal with this on our terms, and I would make the terms as fair as I possibly could in the business sense. Fine, we won't deal with you. Leave you to your own devices and see what happens in your own nation when your government hasn't got the means to feed the population. We're probably either going to see a new government or the nation will die out altogether. In either case, not a matter of concern for anyone here in America, particularly pursuant to the Constitution of the United States. Not our business, and never should have been. So I make a limited apology for that we've been over there all these decades, committing the evils and the violence that we have done over there. That said, the sooner we quit doing that and get back on relatively neutral terms, the better off we're going to be. So, sorry, Muhammad, you're wrong on this one. Even if most Muslims are the nonviolent types, and there may be many who are, but the risk is too great, just as it was in World War II. And this is one of the few things that Roosevelt did that I've ever agreed with. And be in mind here, too, that a lot of Germans were interned for the same reason. You don't hear nearly as much about them as you do about the Japanese. But we were, of course, in a state of war with Germany as well. But the Japanese, and it was basically limited to the West Coast, and you can see the problem. Japan had taken over Hawaii after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and were able to fly planes over here. Who knows how many subterranean allies they would have had that would have come out of the woodwork to aid and abet the attack on the Pacific coast. I mean, you just can't get around that situation. Well, okay, there is one way, because as history records, and I mentioned it in earlier videos, we basically entrapped the Japanese into entering the war by realizing that the attack on Pearl Harbor was going to come. I mean, we'd broken the Japanese code. We didn't know exactly when maybe, but we knew it was coming. And more than that, as I've said in other videos, Army Air Force Colonel Billy Mitchell was saying for over a decade before that there was going to be an attack on Pearl Harbor, because he knew that was the graduation exercise for the Japanese military. And all he got for his trouble was a court-martial by the United States powers that be. So you tell me, now if Japan would have made that kind of argument, or if Korematsu would have in his case, and he didn't, by the way, that might have produced a somewhat different outcome. The other interesting point, and I'm going to be a little redundant here because I mentioned this in the Korematsu video, but 4 years later, the Supreme Court in the Takahashi case, Takahashi versus the California Coastal Commission, 334 U.S. 408, I believe. I'll get the site for you in the notes at the bottom. 4 years later, the Supreme Court decided that Japanese were not citizens. If that's the case 4 years earlier, what was the factual foundation and legal basis for Korematsu even to be there? If he's an undocumented enemy alien, that's what they treat us white people like now. They think we're undocumented enemy aliens. That's how crazy it's gotten in Washington, D.C. You can look it up. It's 8 U.S.C. 1324A and 50 U.S.C., I think it's 17 through sections 21. They think we are undocumented enemy aliens, and they're still in the state of war when that state of war ostensibly was settled at the Appomattox Courthouse 150 years ago. This is much, you're going to get a lot more about this one in a separate video, trust me. This is as crazy as that seems on the surface. It's not. I can prove every bit of it. Thank you.